Hello class, for today we're going to be going over the trigonometric graphing with amplitude, phase shift, and vertical shift all combined together. When you're doing these problems, please note that these will be the review questions for tomorrow. You'll most likely see a component of those three things combined all into one, and you will have to be able to graph all those three things when you're given the frame and the phase shift and all that stuff. You may use the original graph and then convert it and then move it left or right depending on the phase shift. You can draw it that way, or you can just go straight to just drawing the graph transformation right away. It's really up to you. Okay, so first of all, I'm going to go over two questions that has the grid marks like this already laid out for me. The other two, I have to create the grid on my own, and then you will have questions similar to this for your homework for today. That will be your review for tomorrow. Okay, so graph the following. First of all, we have amplitude, phase shift, and vertical shift, and I'll ask you to identify them. What is going to be my amplitude here would be 2. The phase shift will be pi over 4 to the right, and then vertical shift will be 1 down. And once you have laid out all those things in the table, you will have to utilize the amplitude and vertical shift first. So 1 unit down means I'm going to the -1. Amplitude of 2 means I'm going down 2 and I'm going up 2. So I have this frame laid out into the graph, and then the phase shift is pi over 4 units to the right. And if you remember, for the sign, you know that you start with either max or min. But for negative sign, you know that it starts at minimum. So at pi over 4, what happens is this becomes your starting point. I'm sorry, your sine graph always starts at the middle. It's not max or min. I'm thinking of cosine. You're always starting at the middle value. And once you have already found that out, that is your starting value. And then you're going to go right twice because you know that when you're alternating amongst pi for between max, middle, and min, you always move increments by pi over 2. So what that means is once you move right by pi over 2, you go up to max. Another pi over 2, you go to middle. Another pi over 2, you go to min. Another pi over 2, you go to mid. And then once you repeat the cycle over and over again, you will see that the graph will look something like this. Now your original graph, where it started with here, I'm sorry, that's not the, when you started here, it moves to the left. Pi over 2 reaches max and it moves to the left. Oh, I actually were supposed to move it to the right, so that's my apologies. So let me just finish all of this. So these points should be out of the way. Okay, so I guess I can't erase anymore. So here, what we're going to do is we are going to plot a point that's going to be to the right of pi over 4. And then you go increments by pi over 2, because that is the alternating between max, mid, and minimum. That's the increments by. So I'm going to go up, mid, min, and then, well, it's going to be somewhere here. And then here, I'm going to go down here, 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 and then here. So once I plot those points here, I'm going to have a graph that looks, the original graph would start from here and then move to the right by pi over 4. Then it reaches max at pi over 2 because, like I said, that's the increment. And then you move to the right by pi over 4. And then so forth and so forth and so forth. And so you will get this particular graph. In the red, that will be the original. But the black line is actually what you're going to be plotting. So this should be the answer right away. If you have any questions for tomorrow, the easy number that you want to memorize is pi over 2. Because pi over 2 is the increment in which how much you are switching between middle, max, middle, minimum, and then another middle. So that's increment of twice in this particular graph grid that I'm giving you. Alright, so let's try this question on your own. And then if you're writing down on your notes, please have this written down somewhere. And please try doing the amplitude, phase shift, and vertical shift. And then make sure you have the framework first. And then plot it for me once you have it. Okay, so assuming that you have already gotten this down, I'm going to go through these really quickly because it's more of a review. Now, I always want to identify amplitude, phase shift, and vertical shift whenever I can. So amplitude here would be a 3, vertical shift will be 2 down, and then phase shift will be pi over 2 to the left. These three things are already identified for me every single time. So vertical shift 2 down means I'm going to start from -2 here. Then amplitude is 3, means I go down 3. I know that's out of scale, but assume that that's going to be at -5. And then up 3 means I'm going to be at +1. Now that's my framework in which I'm going to be at. And then I'm going to start from pi over 2 to the left, and it's cosine, so I'm going to start from either max or min depending on the sign. Because it's negative, I'm going to start from minimum. So at pi over 2 to the left, which is here, I'm going to start at not at maximum, because that will be my original without the negative sign. I'm going to start at the minimum at pi over 2. Because whatever the point was that over here, it moved left by pi over 2. Then every increment is pi over 2, switching between max, min, or min. Since I started minimum, then I'm going to go 2 units to the right, which is pi over 2 increment. I'm going to start at middle. Then another pi over 2 units increment, I'm going to end up being maximum. Pi over 2, middle, pi over 2, minimum, and then this can go on and on and on. On the other direction, I'm going to do the same thing. So my graph will look something like this. Notice how this will be exactly the same as the sine graph because it starts from the middle and then it goes up to the top. It should be exactly sine of theta, 3 sine of theta minus 2. When we're incrementing left or right by pi over 2, we can see how that's going to be the same as the sine graph. Okay, so one more example, and then I'm going to ask you to do the last question on your own. This one, I don't give you a grid, so you need to draw the grid on your own. So let's say that I have 5 sine of theta plus pi minus 1. All of you guys should be able to identify for me what amplitude, phase shift, and vertical shift is. Amplitude is 5, phase shift is pi to the left, and then vertical shift to 1 unit down. Remember, the sign is positive, means you're moving it to the left. Now, after all those things have been identified, you're going to start from 1 unit down, which is at -1. Then I'm going to go 1, 2, 3, 4. Ooh, maybe I should just draw the increments first. So let's say let's say I go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. Okay, and then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. I don't really need to draw that much, but for the extra increments, I will do pi over 2, pi, 3 pi over 2, and then 2 pi, negative pi over 2, negative pi, negative 3 pi over 2, and then negative 2 pi. Okay, so all those increments have been added. Now at -1 is where I'm going to draw my midline. Then I'm going to go down 5, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, which is down here at -6. And then I'm going to go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 up there, which is at +4. Again, I always start with my framework. Then once that's been established, I go to pi to the left, which means my starting value would be at -pi. This is where I'm going to start, okay? And it's sine, so I know I start at the middle, which is here. It's positive sine, by the way, so my next increment, which will happen at -pi over 2, because I told you, it happens every pi over 2 increment. That switches amongst max, mid, and min. So at -pi over 2, I'm going to go up to max because it's a positive sign. Okay, positive sign means I go up that way from my starting value. Then at 0, I'm going to go all the way down to, to the middle. Then at pi over 2, it goes to the middle, minimum. And at pi, it's going to be at the middle. So I'm going to go like this. Then at 3 pi over 2, max. And then 2 pi, middle again. -3 pi over 2, minimum. And then -2 pi, middle. So that would be my graph for 5 sine theta plus pi. Just to verify, the amplitude here is indeed 5. Your middle line is at -1. And then this particular point, the original one that was supposed to go this way, now imagine I move everything to the left by pi, and then that's going to where it's going to end up being at. Okay, so the red line was my original without the phase shift, but with the phase shift, I'm going to get the black line of the sine graph. Last question for today. Please try this on your own. Pause the video now, and then check it again once you have it. Amplitude here would be 1, phase shift would be 2 pi to the left, and vertical shift would be 5 units down. So if I were to draw this grid mark here, my x values will not really change whatsoever. Pi, 3 pi over 2, and positive 2 pi. The negative pi over 2, negative pi, negative 3 pi over 2, and then negative 2 pi. And then 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. It's going to be a very small graph, relatively, because I'm going to start at -5 here for my midline. Then since my amplitude is 1, I'm going to go up 1, and then I'm going to go down 1. Then what I'm going to do here is that I am going to take the cosine, a negative cosine to be exact, and this starts at minimum because my positive cosine starts at maximum. So I'm going to go to my 2 pi to the left, which means I'm going to start from -2 pi. I start from the minimum. Then at 3 pi over 2, because I told you the increment is always pi over 2. To go to middle, max, middle, minimum, middle, and then this cycle continues to do so, and then I'll get a graph that looks like that. This is perfectly enough for me because it indicates that every increment that you have made is pi over 2, and all of those points are on the right spot. As long as I can see that, that's going to be okay. For today, you're going to get 4 questions just like this, 1, 2, 3, 1, 2, 3, 4, for your final review for tomorrow. And for tomorrow, you will also get 4 questions for your quiz. Make sure you label all of the identification part, where it's amplitude, phase shift, and vertical shift, and then also the graphing portion as well. Make sure you have that for me. And take care. Have a good day.